Welcome to week 4. All right, you did the midterm. You'll have to do that process one more time at the end of the class. I would think that it's not too bad. It's just a bunch of short answer questions, right? So what happened on the discussion boards? 2 of them regarding Jainism and Sikhism. There was the discussion going on about violence versus non-violence, and why do Sikhs carry swords, kirpans is what they're called. It's supposed to just be a non-aggressive thing for the most part, other than fighting tyranny, I suppose, in a sense, is aggressive. It's not exactly the same thing as self-defense, but it still is provoked in a certain sense, right? I thought probably the more interesting question on that discussion board is why isn't Jainism considered a sect of either Hinduism or Buddhism? And for that one, I saw a lot of different points made on the discussion board. So let me recap some of these. Non-violence, again, is a huge part of Jainism. And that's one thing that makes it different than Hinduism or Buddhism. The universe doesn't have a creator God in Jainism. Related to that, there's Buddhism doesn't believe we have souls. Hinduism believes in Brahman, the universal soul, and we're all just drops in the ocean. But Jainism does have the view that is probably more familiar to most of us, that we each have our own individual souls. They're jivas. Jinas are the gods, right? By gods, I mean something more similar to how you might think of as like Greek gods, right? These are not all-powerful gods. These are just divine entities, right, that they affirm, which is kind of like Hinduism, but also Hinduism is the idea of Brahman, right, which is an important difference. What else was a difference? There was, they reject the Hindu scriptures of the Vedas. If it was going to be a sect of either, it'd probably be Hinduism, but there's enough differences that it makes sense to think of it just as its own religion. And this is just a list that I collected from you guys. So you did a good job of finding those differences. Regarding the other discussion board, probably the most interesting, the one you almost all focused on is Confucianism a religion, right? We are in world religions, and we've got this ism, but we're not sure if it's a religion. There was somewhat of a split. More of you thought that it's a philosophy, not a religion. And mostly the reason why you would think it's philosophy is that it does focus especially on things like ethics and social roles and the role of government, and where it does kind of delve into holy things, it's just kind of giving advice regarding how you ought to participate in these holy things, right? So it still seems to be a lot of advice, but there were actually some interesting answers for why it should be a religion, considered a religion. So for example, Caden thought it's a religion because sorry, I'm getting some sun in my eyes. It advocates a lot of religious ceremonies and holy places, and he's got these teachings from heaven, and so there's definitely a religious undertone to a lot of it. It'd be kind of an ancient Chinese religion that it'd be referring to. And so maybe this is the way of preserving that ancient Chinese religion through the lens of Confucius, right? Another interesting point that was made is, so I think Triton made this point, that it's kind of similar in how it started to a lot of religions. Compare it to Buddhism. Buddhism is probably the most interesting one to compare it to, because Buddhism is probably the next closest question as far as is this a religion, because the Buddha didn't really care whether any gods exist. He thinks they probably do, but it's just not important, because what matters is enlightenment and escaping suffering and all that, right? So you've got this seminal figure at the beginning of both of them, Confucius and Buddha, and you've got teachings that don't really focus on higher powers very much. So if Buddhism is a religion, then why not Confucianism? That's an interesting argument. There is definitely a more of a supernatural element, though, to Buddhism, in the sense that the main goal of the whole teachings, well, and there are also different versions of Buddhism, but the main goal of all the teachings is something that you would probably think of as supernatural, nirvana. Yeah, and then again, there also are, in certain versions of Buddhism, there's bodhisattvas, which are kind of supernatural beings. They're humans who are now pretty much supernatural beings. Anyway, hopefully that gives you enough of a sense of things that I saw on the discussion board that were good, and a good review there. We're going to keep it going now into Judaism and Christianity, which is, I'm sure, for most of you, what you're most familiar with, but hopefully that this gives you a new way to think about those two.